All right, as we continue to explore disparities and problems around crime and justice, we're going to start looking into disparities by race in terms of crime and punishment. In the last video, we mentioned at the end that there are a number of reasons why statistics can be skewed, particularly around crime and arrest rates, but that we do actually tend to see higher levels of crime in Black and brown communities. We thought through three different theories of how we might explain this. There's Merton's strain theory, that there are few avenues to legitimate success in our country. Labeling theory, the self-fulfilling prophecy. Um, and differential association theory. And in reality, all of these probably help us to understand a little bit of why we might see more crime in Black communities. The important thing to understand is that the factors are social. It's not in our blood or in our bodies. It's in the world around us. One key concept come up with by sociologist Catherine Russell Brown is that of criminal Black man. This refers to the pervasive image in our society of Black men as criminals. For example, in these two burglary cases, think about the images presented. How do we present images of Black men and white men in our society? Here's where labeling theory might actually help us to understand some of these higher crime rates. Evening news, films, television shows are constantly presenting us with these kind of images of young and old Black men. And for many, if they see these images over and over, they get a message from it that this is what society sees me as, or maybe this is what I am or will have to be. So part of what we're thinking about here is how does something like being labeled something encourage a particular type of behavior? We can also think about differential association. If we do see higher crime rates in Black communities, perhaps it's if one grows up in those communities and they see it more, then those kinds of crimes don't become seen as abnormal or criminal in some ways. This could be true for things as simple as drug use or gang violence. But we also need to think of some of the broader social factors. We know through many studies that it's harder if you're Black to get a loan, to get housing in higher end neighborhoods. That in predominantly Black neighborhoods, housing values are devalued by retail markets. So these structures also do a number of things. They create a more ground for criminal activity, but they can also have the effect of excluding folks from legitimate job markets. Remembering that 30 or 40 years ago, our entire economy shifted away from manufacturing, and a whole swath of middle class jobs essentially went away. In this way, many people were actually forced out of legitimate job markets and had to get jobs that are paid off the books and sometimes are not legitimate jobs, dealing drugs, running rackets, protection rings. So these are also things that can help us understand the complex things that might actually lead to higher crime rates in Black communities. Incarceration presents us with a very different problem. We know that there are a lot more Black men in prison than there are in our overall society. The number is totally disproportionate. 1 in 3 Black men will go into a prison even though they only make up, less than 10% of our overall population. And how in the world does that happen? Well, part of what we have to understand is the pervasive concept of Black men as criminal leads to more interaction with the criminal justice system. Police stop them more. Police are in Black neighborhoods more. But we also see that in the late 1980s, if we want to look at this chart here, what we're examining is the disparity or the difference between prison admissions for different types of crimes. for black and white um, men in particular. Sorry, men and women. And we'll note that there are disparities in all of these different categories, including violent crimes, robbery, burglary, or theft. But one that really spikes in the late 80s is drug admissions. So this is in the same time period that we see the crack epidemic in black communities, um, which again, um, and the war on drugs, which was initiated by the federal government. So part of what we have to understand is that there are federal policies that create this issue. And these have led to longstanding resentments in different communities, such as the Black Lives Matter movement. So here again, part of what we see is differences in understandings of um, the reaction to racial disparities and criminal justice treatment. So this is a poll by the Wall Street Journal asking people um, what they thought the cause of the unrest in Baltimore was, that looking after the death of Mike Brown and really at the heart of the Black Lives Matter movement. And what we see is that far more white people than black folks are likely to see people simply looking for an excuse to engage in looting and violence. That's the chart on the right here, as opposed to long-standing frustrations of mistreatment of African Americans. So yeah, again, here's where that idea of blackness and criminality that's so pervasive in our media is affecting the way people even do something like see um, movements against incarceration and police violence, which we'll look more in our last video. Another general issue is to understand that the US as a country incarcerates more people than any other country in the world relative to our population. And this again started in that same war on drugs period in the late 1970s and 1980s, in which we have more and more prisons and more people in those prisons. And why are we sending more people to prison? Well, there are laws keeping them there, 3-strike laws, which we'll talk a bit more about in our discussion board. But there is also an expansion of for-profit prisons. A quick examination of this system shows that the percentage of people of color is much higher in private prisons. Now, these are operated for profit, in which the state essentially hires at the prison manufacturing. The thing about this kind of contracting is that if the state doesn't fill up those beds, they either have to pay a penalty or a fine on that. And they still have to essentially pay for the bed space. So there's actually a kind of incentive for the state and the government to keep the beds of the prison filled, a for-profit incentive. This is another way we can start to understand the wide disparities in who is in prison and why they're there.